For the main attraction of why you came to the webinar, I would like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Roland. She currently teaches on the faculty at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's an oral and written language specialist in the neurology department at Children's Hospital in Boston, where she works as part of an interdisciplinary team to diagnose children with learning disabilities and provide recommendations to parents and schools. She has an EDD from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and an MS in Speech Language Pathology from MGH Institute of Health Professions. Please help me welcome Dr. Roland.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for attending. It's great to be back and great to hear from everyone. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions as well as I go through. And feel free to use the chat since we'll be responding to that and taking your questions as we go. I'd like to also make this very interactive, so we do have a few poll questions scattered throughout. And please do take the time to answer those so I can get feedback as to who you are and be able to welcome you also. So welcome to this presentation. This is 5 ways to develop executive functioning for early learners. And luckily, these 5 ways are free, so I'm really going to be focusing on things you can do in your classroom on a daily basis to really help early learners develop executive function. I'm also going to be talking about why that's so important, especially in the early years. So let's go ahead and get started. So I first want to just take 1 second and have you answer this question as to what is your primary role or interest with students in terms of their executive functioning skills. So are you a teacher, aide, or specialist working directly with young students, or an administrator looking for ways to improve early learning? We also wonder, are you a parent of a child with issues, or do you work in a private setting? So just maybe take a few seconds to answer that question, and I'll look forward to hearing your responses. All right, so far it looks like we have 100% teacher, aide, or specialist. Let me just take a few seconds to see who else responds. All right, it looks like so far we have only teacher, aides, and specialists, which is great because this is actually designed precisely for you. So this is really about the classroom setting and what you can do on a daily basis. And I've also worked in many classroom settings as a co-teacher and a speech-language pathologist. And I'm very aware of how challenging it can be to work with classrooms of young children and really think about how do you do this preventatively and proactively rather than reactively. And that's really going to be the focus of this presentation today, is how do you merge learning with executive function training in a way that's very helpful to children and in a way that actually preserves their ability to develop these skills as well. So we're increasingly recognizing that young children can also be supported to develop these skills themselves. So let's go ahead and move on. So first, really thinking about what is executive functioning. Well, really, we can think about it what's called sort of the air traffic controller of the brain. So it's these areas in the front of the brain, primarily driven by what's called the prefrontal cortex, that really help us in terms of managing attention, inhibiting our responses, is stopping ourselves from doing one thing in order to do something else, shifting our attention, so really managing not to focus only on one thing, but to change and focus on something else, and understanding how to manage our resources mentally. So if you think about an air traffic controller, they're constantly having to manage all of these different inputs. So planes are coming in, some planes are taking off, and they really need to figure out what do we do in that situation in order to not have any crashes and in order actually to have everything function well. And that involves a whole collection of skills organized at this front of the brain. So as we look further, we can think about how executive function skills develop. And I've shown these 2 pictures because really we think about it in terms of the brain as moving from this idea of country roads to highways. So this really means that we're thinking first about country roads being nice, slow ways to get information through. So information does move, but it's kind of drifting in. There's lots of other things to be looking at. It's not very efficient. We're moving towards something that's increasingly efficient and quick, kind of like the information superhighway of the brain. So executive function actually allows us to do that. And it develops these skills throughout our lives, but especially in the early years. So really, just as a summary here, executive function are processes enabling us to plan, focus our attention, remember instructions, and juggle tasks successfully. And really, acquiring the building blocks of these skills is one of the most important and challenging tasks of the early childhood years. So we often think about reading, writing, and math as the primary skills to be learned in early childhood. But really, we're starting to realize that these skills are foundational for the academic skills. So without these skills, academic learning really is a challenge to happen. And so actually, rather than just focusing on academic learning, we need to also focus on executive function. And we're going to actually take a look at your classroom to consider the executive function skills. So I want you just to take a moment, since we did have so many people as classroom teachers or aides, and think about your particular classroom and how the executive function skills are working there. So this may be ways in which executive function skills are working very well for children. So maybe most of your children are having a great time inhibiting their responses and not shouting out answers, but raising their hands, shifting their attention when you're moving from one topic to a next, or something like that. There also likely are children or situations, times in your classroom where this isn't working so well, right? So times when some children are shouting out, some children are not following directions as easily as they could be. Times in the classroom might feel more chaotic than you might want. So I want you just to take a moment and think about your classroom and ways that executive function is supporting learning, and maybe ways that it's not supporting learning as well as you'd want it to be. And then actually, as we move forward, I'd like you to take a second and answer this question. So what one executive function skill do you think your students could most improve? So the first is called inhibitory control. So that's the idea of stopping one response to enable another response. So that would mean perhaps not shouting out answers, but actually raising their hand first. So working memory is another. And that's really holding some things in memory in order to manipulate information. So that could be actually working with numbers, working with letters, and things like that. The next is cognitive flexibility. And that's really a term meaning switching from one task to the next. So maybe you might say, okay, now we're moving from our reading activities to a writing activity. And how easily can children manage that transition? Or you might have something else that comes to mind. So take a moment and answer that question so I can get a sense of what is the most challenging thing or one skill that your students could improve. And so it looks like right now working memory is the biggest challenge. We have some cognitive flexibility and some inhibitory control as well. So 71% saying working memory. And I definitely agree with that. So I think following directions for young children can be a very big challenge. And that is something that can really either promote learning if it's used effectively and efficiently, or can make learning very difficult, as you've probably seen. So we'll talk more about that as we go along, and I will focus on the working memory component of things. So moving along, we're going to think about two different scenarios. So first, how does a classroom look when executive function skills are supporting learning? So this really means when they're working sufficiently well and efficiently, and that learning is actually supported rather than inhibited. So this looks like something like this. So teachers are engaging children and helping them manage their attention. So we often think about executive function skills as developing over the lifespan, and especially in the preschool years. But obviously, they're not very well developed for young children. So often teachers need to be the executive function support for young children. They're not going to be fully able to do all of these things themselves. However, we can also realize that even at this young age, children can help themselves and their peers to regulate their attention and behavior. And we'll talk about some ways to do that and some ways to help empower even young children to help regulate attention, behavior, and start to regulate their own executive function skills. And this might be your classroom on a good day or on a day when you feel that things have been sort of successful and that your strategies are working well. At the same time, not every day looks like that, and so you do want to take some time to think about how does a classroom look when executive function skills are detracting from learning. This may be a challenging day or a situation, for instance, when many children are struggling with executive function skills. So for example, inhibiting their responses, shifting their attention, in a way that distracts others. And this might mean that some children are shouting out so much that other children can't hear, or some children are really stuck on the prior task and can't move to the next one. And this might be enough so that the classroom learning is not functioning as well as you want it to. This also can happen when the teacher feels as though they must spend time reactively to help manage executive function skills in a way that takes away from learning time. So this might mean that rather than helping children proactively manage attention, for instance, you're now trying to collect all of the children from their prior activity and move them forward in a way that has taken much longer than you would have liked. And this can be very frustrating, both for children, but especially for the teacher, because learning doesn't feel as efficient or as deep as it could be. So we'll talk about what to do there as well. And then we're just going to think about how do each of these skills play out in the classroom. And this is a chart that you can go back to also, since it will be stored. And think about each skill. It talks about what it is, and then potential issues. So we're going to focus on working memory, since you talked about that as a primary issue in your classrooms. And working memory is this idea of following multi-step directions. So understanding stories, working with numbers. And this is really using information and manipulating it in the moment. It's not just remembering information, but actually manipulating it. So it might be doing simple math or reading. It might be listening to a story and responding and things like that. When children are having issues with working memory, they might get lost when they're given multiple instructions. They might remember one part, but then struggle to follow the rest of it. They also might be unable to follow stories. So while they're answering a question, they might have forgotten the first part of the story entirely. And this happens typically at times with young children, but when it happens so much, it can become an issue and detract from learning. Inhibitory control is also one I see a lot in classrooms with young children, where children have trouble inhibiting or stopping a response. They might speak out of turn. They might push someone, not out of malice, but just because they're so excited to get on the playground that they push past and don't follow the rules they know they should. We have others as well, so this is just a nice resource for you, but to also think about things like relational reasoning, the ability to recognize patterns, which is very important, especially in early learning, and spatial ability. So we're thinking about not just numbers and letters, but also how to manipulate objects in space mentally. So we can think about executive functioning skills developing in the early years very rapidly. So as we see here, they develop over the lifespan, but there's a big window here. I have the ages listed on the bottom and the skill proficiency on the side. And so you see here this line going drastically upward from ages 3 to about 6. And this is something like a window for executive function skills. So if you've seen children grow from age 3 to 6, you see that typically these skills take a drastic upswing in those years. And that's great to see, both because young children can learn and are learning so much about these skills, but also because they can be helped very much during this time. It's also interesting to notice that this actually doesn't end right at age 6, so these continue, and even 25-year-olds are still working on these skills. So there's also a sense just to understand the healthy development of these skills. So they don't just pop up at age 3 and start becoming developed. Even at 1 year old, you can see these skills starting to be worked on. So for instance, for 1-year-olds, they're starting to use their working memory because they can do simple 1-step and 2-step tasks typically. So when you tell a 1-year-old, please go pick that up, right? They're often able to follow the instruction. And these instructions and their ability to follow them becomes increasingly complex over the years. So that a 2 to 3-year-old can hold in mind 2 rules, and that 4 to 5-year-olds can understand that appearance is not always equal reality. So when they're given a sponge that looks like a rock, they understand that it's not really a sponge. So really a rock, excuse me. So moving along, you can just have other skills here. So cognitive flexibility. So even 1-year-old, we have some skills there. So retrieving objects at 1-year-old, but then 2 to 3 years old and 4 to 5 years old, they actually are able to shift their actions according to changing rules. So they understand, for instance, that At home, we take off our shoes. At school, we don't take off our shoes, right? And they're able to adapt to those changing rules. And these things develop typically, there's always a range. So there's always a very broad typical range for these. So even if you see a child who has some issues with this, it might not be a deficit or deficiency. It might just be within the typical range. So then we'll think about, why is executive functioning so important? Well, there's several reasons why. First, we know that these are somewhat of a baseline for children to actually develop math and language skills. So as we've seen from the research, children who have stronger working memory, inhibition, and attentional skills have been found to make larger gains on tests of early math, language, and literacy. And we think this is partially because these children are then available for learning. So they're actually able to sit in classrooms to attend and to gain from the instruction that they're hearing. We also understand that working memory and attentional skills, particularly for low socioeconomic status, children of low socioeconomic status, it predicts achievement even more so than math and reading ability. And this goes to that same idea of that if children are available for learning and they have the executive function skills needed for learning, they're very much able to benefit and learn faster and more efficiently than they would otherwise. And that's great news, since we know that we can work on executive function and can help shore up those baselines. So we know also that executive function skills link to academic success. So they really, having strong executive function skills create a positive cycle for children. And we think of these skills as a building block underlying children's success. So they're, not only do they better able and attend to and benefit from instruction, but they also receive more positive feedback from teachers. And this really creates a kind of spiral. So as children behave and attend better, teachers respond more appropriately or more with sort of more praise to them. And their peers also respond in ways that are more accepting of them. So this creates a kind of spiral where they're increasingly succeeding, they feel successful, and the teachers feel better about their behavior as well. We also understand that EF skills strongly predict academic success. So we think about it as the how of learning in order to help children master the what. So this is not content learning in the sense that it's not math or reading, but it's really the how of learning. So actually being able to be available for instruction, to attend, and things like that. And really strikingly, we know that it predicts not only school performance, but even occupational success in later years. So if we're able to shore up these skills early on, we know that we can set children up for success for many years in the future. And we also know that there are many ways to build EF skills. So there's been a lot of exciting research done recently, especially by Adele Diamond, in terms of what actually helps build EF skills. And so there have been many studies actually researching programs to see what actually helps, what doesn't help, and what's kind of neutral. And we know for a fact that many of these ways can be done in the classroom context through daily activities and routines. So there doesn't have to be a fancy curriculum. It doesn't have to be an entire school program in order to start doing things to support children. In Diamond's research, she found best evidence for computer-based training, martial arts, and 2 curricula, which she talks about in her research. There's some evidence for yoga, mindfulness training, and other curricula, especially for children of 8 and up. But she also found that in all these programs, students need to be progressively challenged, meaning that things need to get harder and harder for them. So if they start mastering EF skills and the program stays at the same level, they will not make the same gains. They actually need to have the program get more and more challenging in order to make the same amount of gains. So we also want to think about the importance of metacognition to EF skills. And metacognition is really just a fancy term for thinking about thinking, or thinking about what we know. We often think about this as something that older children and adults do, but even younger children can do this as well. So things like adults thinking, for instance, when do I work best? When do I learn best? This is really thinking about our thinking about our processing in ways that's very self-reflective. And building these skills, even for young children, allows them to take control over their own learning and attention. So rather than just to be passive recipients of learning, they're actually able to start thinking about, okay, how can I manage my attention? How can I manage my engagement? What happens when I'm bored? What do I do when I'm starting to lose attention? And things like that. So we want to start thinking about how to have what's called a metacognitive classroom. So rather than just thinking about how do I manage students' attention, or what do I do to students, we want to think about what can we help children do on their own? How can we start to build students' skills to help them manage their own attention and behavior? And these are things that can be started even at the pre-K level. So we often think about young children as needing help, needing support, and they often do. But we can also think about them as having a lot of skills already that we can start to bolster to help them become more metacognitive about their own learning. And so we're going to look a little bit into the research. And one person who's done a lot of work on this is called Dr. Judy Willis. And she's a neurologist and also a middle school teacher. And she's done a lot of work on metacognition and executive function. She's someone whose research I would suggest looking into if you're interested in this area. And she suggests that there are several ways of helping children with metacognition in the classroom. One of them is really frequently having students apply their learning. So rather than just leaving things theoretical, as much as possible to take learning activities and to move them into the real world. So this might be taking a math problem and actually applying it to an exercise with measuring immediately, or taking a counting problem and applying it to something involving the trees that you're growing outside. Anything that can be immediately applied is often very helpful in terms of developing executive function skills. We can also introduce students to activities to exercise their executive function skills, and finally model higher order thinking skills. This is what we often call a think aloud, so where the teacher will actually describe his or her thinking as he or she goes through the day or goes through an activity as a way to show how different problems can be solved and what to do when one encounters a difficulty. So this might be something in the later grades in terms of, for instance, working through a word problem. In the early grades, it might just be trying to figure out, for instance, an estimation. If there's a jar of jelly beans, the question is, how many jelly beans are there? I think aloud might be something like, oh, I think there are more than 20, but there's definitely less than 1,000. Let me start thinking about what a good number would be. So that would be sort of the start of something called a think aloud there. And that really helps children not just to figure out an answer, but to really start to understand what processes the learners go through to get that answer. So I want to take a minute and ask a question in terms of how effective do you feel your methods are currently working to build executive function skills now? So you could say, I'm not sure I'm actually addressing them at all, which is totally fine. I think what I'm doing is working okay, so I think classroom activities are building new skills, or other. So just take a moment to answer that, and I will listen to the results. So far, 100%, I'm not sure I'm actually addressing them at all. Okay, so let's see, I'll take one more second to see if there's any more responses. All right, so far it looks like 100% I'm not sure I'm addressing them at all, which is totally fine and seems very common. So that's good to know. And I think that this is very common among teachers of young children. In part, I do want to ensure you that I'm sure you are addressing them to some extent. So a lot of times there might just be different terms for these skills than the ones that you're used to using. But most likely you are doing something to address them, because even helping the classroom run smoothly and adjusting behavior is often doing something to address them. At the same time, it can be very helpful to get the terms for these skills clear and to really think consciously about what you're currently doing that you might not be aware of and what you could do differently. So we're going to start talking about 5 free ways to develop executive function skills in early learners. And I'll talk through them and then talk about the research that exists for other ways as well. So the first way I want to talk about is just having students retell stories, focusing on the main points. So this is just really, if you do a storytelling activity in your classroom or have a read aloud, you can work with children to actually have them retell stories and think about how to focus on the main points of the stories. So what this does is really help students do several things. First, they have to read out extraneous details. They have to think about what actually is not necessary to that story, what was a nice detail but not actually important to the plot. And you'll see that young children often struggle with this, especially at first, because they'll want to talk about all the ways that the dress in the picture was very pretty and things like that, but not necessarily realizing that that's not a critical part of the story. It also allows them to prioritize. So think about what is the most important point here. So all of these points might be important. What is the most important? And it also allows them to consider the role of time. You can often challenge children to think about, okay, I'm going to give you 30 seconds or 45 seconds to summarize this story. What can you tell me? And try to have them not just speak as fast as possible, but actually think about sort of what do I need to say in that amount of time to get the story across. And all of these things help them think not just about the story, but really about their own learning and their own thinking. So what's the most important? What out of all the ideas I have are the ones that I actually want to use? So secondly, you can have students rate their energy or attention throughout the day. And there are many ways you can do this, especially for young children. You'll likely need something that's very concrete. So something like a chart or stickers or things like that that can help you rate it. There's many programs that can do this. So Mark Brackett has a program called Ruler that does a rating of energy and attention and mood throughout the day. However, you can also develop your own. And this can really think about not just how energetic they are and how happy they feel, but really think about sort of how their mood matches what you're about to do. So for instance, if they're very, very excited and energetic, that's great if you're about to go out to the playground. That might not be so great if it's quiet time or nap time. So really once they're aware of what their energy and attention level is, they're often able to start to regulate with help that attention or energy so that it works out a little bit better for them in terms of what's happening. This allows them to reflect on themselves and their own engagement and learning and can be a starting point to discuss ways to regulate their energy throughout the day. So children, especially in the early grades, are not often able to regulate themselves all the time. So they often need help. So even something as simple as turning down the lights when you realize that children are overly excited is a very basic starting point to helping manage energy and attention. So you can also give students scaffolds and supports to shift their attention. So oftentimes young children have a lot of trouble moving from one topic or idea to the next. And they often aren't as aware of time as you might want them to be. So some things you can do is just to try to make everything as concrete as possible in terms of signals and cues. Some of these things are time management tools. So I've seen some teachers who have maybe a list of 5 things or 5 minutes left, and every minute they take off one piece of the sign or one part of the puzzle until it's all gone. There can be prompts to inhibit or initiate responses. So one sign that suggests that now it's time to go to brainstorm, and one time suggests pull back, and tools to brainstorm as well. So these are concrete ways to help students come up with ideas. You might have even a ball and throw the ball around so that students are now aware of whose turn is it to speak, whose turn is it to have an idea or to say their idea. And this kind of concrete way of working allows them to change their attention. So also, we can really think about preventative strategies. So we want to think about in having a metacognitive classroom how to support students before their behavior or attention deteriorates. So rather than reacting, we want to think about how do we work proactively. And you can, for instance, offer students a checklist, often with visuals, saying what to do when I feel overwhelmed, what to do when I feel bored, and things like that. And recognize that these events or experiences will happen, that they're okay, but we want to think about how do we manage them before we start feeling overwhelmed. You also can check in with students prone to having difficulties in certain areas. For instance, if you know that some students are going to have trouble listening to a long story, can you check in with them? Can you provide them visual cues or visual parts to the story so that they have something else to focus on? And enlisting peer support. So to try to do this in a way that doesn't feel punishing, but that actually helps some peers with stronger skills in certain areas support their peers. That might be having one student sit with another while they're retelling a story and help them retell it, something like that. So, and then finally, we want to help students develop their own toolbox of strategies. So really thinking about not just giving strategies to children or doing things to them, but helping them develop a personalized toolbox of their own strategies. So this might be that you have strategies from which students can select, things like that, rating their attention or mood, and that you have materials present in the classroom. And you provide frequent reminders or reviews of options. So we want to remember that young children aren't often able to just come up with ideas themselves about how to regulate attention, but they are often able to adapt things that you currently have and use it to make it work for them. We want to also think about other ways to build executive function skills. So we talked about these ways, computer-based training, martial arts, and curricula. We also want to think about what can we do in a way that doesn't have to involve the whole school. So we know that research on intervention shows us that EF skills suffer when children are under stress, upset, or not physically fit. So we know that actually building children's social, emotional, and physical needs often helps with their strong EF skills as well. And interventions can work on targeting these areas also. So this is just something as simple as, if children are hungry, if children are upset, they're often not available for learning either, and their EF skills suffer as well. So we know that there's many ways to build up EF skills, and we want to talk a little bit about the curricula as well. So for instance, one curriculum called Tools of the Mind instructs teachers in how to organize and manage instructions so that children are building self-regulation skills. And the nice thing about this curriculum is that it actually involves a lot of literacy as well. So it uses fairy tales, chapter books, and intentional pretend play to do this. And this is great because we're sort of blending in content with executive function skills. And we know that these two things can go together and work together well. Just in terms of the research on that, there's been some randomized controlled trials, which is seen as sort of the gold standard of the research in this area, which found positive effects on kindergarten children's EF and attention, as well as their responses to stress. Of note, though, is that teachers were trained in a 2-year cycle, so this does involve a lot of time and investment by the school. And prior studies on Tools of the Mind for pre-K students were found to be mixed. There's also other positive effects seen for what are called curricular add-ons, and I've listed them here. These programs are thought to help level the EF playing field in terms of supporting children, especially from low SES backgrounds, to sort of bolster their EF skills so that they're not working with that typically lower levels that are seen in the research. However, these curricula are also time and resource intensive. That's something to keep in mind. So we want to think about how do you bridge interventions into the classroom. And so there's just a chart here showing the different interventions, the benefits, and the limitations. So what we've seen is that, for instance, martial arts, there's strong evidence of impact, but at the same time, as a teacher, you probably can't teach martial arts per se, right? You need a trained coach, and it's more of an after-school activity. Yoga, there are medium evidence, but some yoga aspects of yoga are harder to implement for children under 8. So in terms of neuroscience-based technology, we also want to think
Dr.
about...
Dr. Roland,
yes.
you cut out there for a few minutes. Can you go back?
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
yeah, you cut
sorry.
out
That's okay.
probably about a slide or two ago. If you could just go back in time and
sure.
just go back a couple of slides. It cut out there.
Sure. Okay.
I'm not sure why, but okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Is that good?
Just push it.
Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Okay.
I can. Yep. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Let's see. Sorry about that. I think I heard it just cut out for a minute. So let me just go back and I think I'll start here again. So as we know, in terms of EF interventions, several curricula have shown promising effects on children's development of EF skills. For example, Tools of the Mind. And this is something that's very nice because it actually weaves in literacy skills as well as EF skills. It uses fairy tales and chapter books. And this is a great thing to keep in mind because it actually has not only the academic part in terms of literacy, but also the EF part in terms of the skill building. We also know that a randomized control trial found positive effects on kindergarten children's EF and attention, as well as their responses to stress. However, we'll note that teachers were trained in a 2-year cycle, so this does actually involve a lot of intervention and investment on the teacher's part. We also have found positive effects for 2 curricular add-ons, and these are thought to help level the EF playing field in the sense of actually supporting children who have lower levels of these skills to build them up so that we can then work at a more level field in terms of building up their academics as well. However, these curricula are very time and resource intensive. That's something to keep in mind. Also, I've just had a chart here about bridging interventions to the classroom. So here it shows interventions, benefits, and limitations. And you'll see that, for instance, martial arts, there's strong evidence of impact, but it does require a trained coach and is more of an after-school activity. Yoga and mindfulness, there's a medium evidence of impact, but some aspects of yoga are difficult to do for children who are under 8, such as meditation. We'll move on and talk a little bit about neuroscience-based technology. So we've seen some evidence that computerized training programs have shown benefits with working memory and attention. Also some of the other areas as well, inhibitory control and selective attention. The nice thing about some of these programs is that they can utilize technology to personalize and adapt to the individual, as well as measuring and tracking data on progress. So when we talked a little bit about being progressively challenging, so actually having a higher level of challenge as the student gets better, that's something that computerized training is ideal for. So one program that's been recently a subject of research is called Kikos Thinking Time. And this is designed to promote executive functioning, reasoning, and spatial skills for children who are aged 3 to 7. And it involves 25 game-based exercises based on neuropsychological tasks that were used in lab research. It is available on a wide variety of browsers. And this is something that's been the subject of various studies recently. So I'll just show you a little bit of the research here. So research has been independently conducted by West Ed, which is an education research agency. And there's been a pilot study with 29 children showing that usage in the classrooms over 2 weeks led to an increase of 4.6 months in reasoning skills as measured by a cognitive assessment. And there's been a larger randomized control trial study with 109 children. And this study has shown promise for improving children's EF, reasoning, and math skills, although more research needs to be done in that area. So just to show you a little bit about Kikos Thinking Time, there's a little fox there, and here it just says, watch the apples tap in the order of small to big. So reordering the sequence. This is a working memory task here. And this is another screenshot of what it looks like. Another screenshot. So here, thinking about patterns. And then this just really shows a summary of sample data from one student. So performance in the age group, you can actually rate how the child is doing versus their peers as well. All right, so I'd like to take some time for questions, and thank you for listening. I really appreciated hearing your feedback from the poll responses, and I look forward to your questions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. We have several questions that have come in, and I will get started. I'm going to click to the last slide here so that everybody can take a look at our last slide while we're doing this. So the first question that came in is, what do we do if we have older students in our classroom? Are there anything that we can do if, say, we have a middle schooler or even an early high schooler? Can some of these things work with older kids along with some of the freebies you talked about and also Kiko?
Yeah, so in terms of the free ones I'm talking about, yes, definitely. There's actually a lot more work being done on tools to help older students with executive function. And these are oftentimes things like breaking larger projects down into pieces, planning for projects. So oftentimes students of that age are dealing with homework that takes place over multiple days and can get very overwhelmed. There's even ways of helping them organize their lockers, for instance. So having a picture on the inside of their locker that's showing what their locker should look like, and so they can actually compare with what their locker does look like, and think about that might be different, perhaps, and things like that. So there's, if you go online, you can find a lot of tools about how to do that with older students. In terms of Kiko, so that doesn't, that wouldn't be as appropriate for older students because it would probably be too easy for them in terms of computerized training. So I think they would get, it's really not meant for that age range. They would get probably bored with it too quickly. So we'd want to think about something else.
Okay, and here's a really good question. You were talking about metacognition a few minutes ago, and what are some clear signs, or are there clear signs that students are engaging in metacognition or thinking about thinking?
Sure. So really the only way to tell this for sure is really to ask students to tell you what they're thinking. So since it's a thought process, we can't really know unless we really hear students responding. But the great way to do that is really to sit and listen to students or to ask them questions. Often you can also prompt students to do this by having them ask questions of each other or of themselves. So things like, what do you think was the best idea you had in that? Or what do you think of these ideas is the one that would most likely work or the one that was most exciting to you? And really those questions are ones that can prompt them to think about their thinking in very day-to-day ways.
And here's a really good question. Can siblings, obviously they're from the same family, same socioeconomic status, can they be expected to develop similarly in their executive function skills?
Not necessarily. So genetics is really only one component of executive function skills and socioeconomic status as well. So children are very individualized in terms of this, and their development is often very individualized as well. One thing that might be similar if they live in the same household and have the same parents is that a lot of that nurture aspect may be the same as well. At the same time, though, just as some children can be very introverted and very extroverted in the same family, children can have very individualized ways in development of these skills. So I wouldn't necessarily expect them to be the same.
And here's a good question that a few people have asked, actually. What is the relationship between executive function skills and, say, ADD or ADHD? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, so
can you tell the difference between those two?
Sure. So there are definitely different. So executive function skills are sort of a group of skills that might be deficient in someone who has one of those disorders. Although at the same time, there's a very wide range of these skills. So if someone struggles, for instance, with inhibitory control, that among a larger constellation of issues might be a sign of ADD or ADHD, but it's definitely not a sign by itself. So we have to recognize that young children, it's very typical for them to work on these skills and to be struggling with aspects of these skills, and that there's a very wide range of their development. At the same time, there are definitely ways of working with children and identifying children who might have ADD or ADHD. And if you're very concerned about a child, I would definitely talk to the parents. So one thing I think about especially is if a child might have ADD or if you're worried about it, is if the child seems to be very outside of the range of peers. So if you think about your whole classroom and if there's a child who really stands out in that area, then that might be a time to be concerned. But at the same time, there is a very wide range of these skills.
And here's a good question. We actually just posted an article about this, a little bit about this on our Facebook page recently. Could too much screen time inhibit development of executive function skills? Screen time meaning TV, iPads, tablets, phones, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yes, there's definitely been a lot of recent questioning about that and research suggesting that obviously, for instance, multitasking, especially multitasking with different devices, is not good for the brain, that too much screen time is not good for the brain. And I definitely agree with that. At the same time, we want to think about how screen time is being used and how to use it effectively and efficiently. So knowing that young children most likely will be using screens at some time, how to not overuse it, for one, and how to use the time that they are using it in a way that's supporting them and their skills. So I definitely would not advocate overuse of screens for anyone, including young children.
Okay, and here's a really, really good question. How do we know if the child is within a typical range of development? Poor control is to be expected for young children. So how do we know, if it's typical development or if it's, if the child is struggling with their executive function skills?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
So definitely yes, definitely. So yeah, it's obviously a very fine line, and I often deal with this question all the time in terms of what is a typical range, what is not typical, and thus far there's not one test or task that's used everywhere to say, okay, here's the cutoff. What I would say is that if there's a concern, that probably means that it's worth having a discussion, at least with the parents, to sort of see what might be going on and to monitor it and see how the progress is happening. So even though children do present with a wide range, if you feel that over time the child is not progressing with their skills and they're sort of continuing to struggle in a way that places them sort of outside the range of their peers, then I would definitely start to think that there might be an issue or something going on. There are tests that can look further at that as well.
Okay, and here's another question. We've got a lot of questions here. And this is an interesting one, how does executive function work with children with autism?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So can I go back to the slide with the different skills? Because I think that would be helpful to show.
Which do you know about where it is?
Yeah, I think it's towards, here. I think it's 15 and 16. Or no, it's 12. So I'll 12 to the audience. Yeah. So certain things might be very difficult for children with autism. So it's not just all executive function skills. We want to think about these as a larger bucket, but that parts of the bucket may be very challenging for children with autism. So particularly, for instance, the cognitive flexibility. So when we think about children with autism having certain rigid behaviors or thought patterns, or being very upset when things change, that's often something that we see in difficulty with cognitive flexibility. At the same time, they can, for instance, some children with autism can have stronger working memory skills, for instance, and less strong flexibility skills. So it's not a single across the board, they're all low. Some might be higher and some might be lower.
And here's a really good question. Has there been a correlation between the number of ACEs or adverse childhood experiences experienced in childhood and lower executive function skills?
So I don't know a specific study on that. I mean, to me, because of what we know about what's called toxic stress, which are adverse experiences such as a child being homeless, moving a lot of the time, abuse, things like that. Those children often do have lower executive function skills, as well as just have difficulty being available for learning as well. So we do know that. And that's where we often really need to, as teachers, have even stronger presence in the classroom in terms of supporting executive function skills.
Okay, and this question, I want to make sure I get it right. So the person that wrote it into us, I believe via the group chat, just make sure that I'm asking it correctly. Do you know about investigations about executive function skills in autism? I'm not, and again, I'm not 100% sure I got that question right in terms of asking you it.
So is there research being, so meaning is there research being done on executive? Yes, yes, I do know that there has been some. I can get you some specific links to those if you're interested. I don't have the links obviously on me, but I'm happy to add some resources at the end to those because I do know there has been some research on that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I got that question. We got that one done. Okay, good. And let's see here. And how do executive function skills transfer then into the classroom? So say a child's got a higher, well-developed executive function skills, do we see a correlation in better academic performance? And you might have addressed this already, but.
Yeah, so definitely. We do see that that the executive function skills we think of provide a real baseline for children to then apply their academic learning and to learn faster. So one of these slides does address that in terms of that children really become more available for learning if they have stronger executive function skills and they learn faster. So we think about supporting these skills, especially for young children, as providing a baseline, which will then help them build their academic skills more effectively.
Great. And here's another good question that came in. Can Kikos Thinking Time be used with non-native English speakers? So say someone comes in and their primary language is Spanish, or, other countries or other languages.
Yes. Yeah. So I think the directions there are very simple. So as long as they understand basic English, they would be fine, since most of them are not English heavy tasks. They probably would need to understand at least basic English, though.
And here's another really good question that came in. How would I use Kikos Thinking Time with students when I have students with a broad range of skills? So say I had a whole classroom of kids, and I was going to use this. Is it feasible, doable?
Yeah, so that's the nice thing about thinking time, and also just computer-based training in general, is that it's often very easy to personalize. So in this case, each student has an account and can be made hard. Will get harder or not harder depending on the student, and that's true of many computerized-based programs.
Okay, and let me see. I'm looking to see if we have any other questions here. I want to make sure I get everybody's. Hold on one second. If anybody has any questions while I'm looking through, just to make sure I covered all the questions. And again, we'll get the research that Dr. Roland mentioned a few minutes ago. And then how can we target these skills during school hours for students living in low SES situations? I think you talked about that a little bit too.
Yes.
So, anything to add on that?
I would just say that I think I did my dissertation research actually on an environment. There are a lot of students struggle with executive functioning skills. And I would just say that this can be a very big challenge for teachers, and that teachers just really need to be almost superstars in this area to really support student skills. So it's sort of all the more important that their skills be stronger, and that it's really a conscious effort on the teacher's part.
Wonderful. Well, that is it for our questions today.